Voidani Empire adjusted her crystalline breathing apparatus as she watched the primitive beings shuffle onto the vast metallic field. Her 4 eyes tracked their movements with a mixture of contempt and curiosity that had defined her species' relationship with lesser civilizations for millennia. The humans, as they called themselves, moved with an awkward grace that seemed almost comical compared to the fluid motions of her own people. Their pale, pink-tinged skin glistened under the artificial suns of the galactic arena, and their strange bipedal gait made them appear perpetually off balance. "These are the creatures that dared to challenge the convergence?" she whispered to her aide, Mordek, whose segmented carapace clicked disapprovingly as he shifted his weight. The convergence had been the galaxy's ultimate test of civilization. For over 3,000 years, a series of trials that determined which species deserved a voice in the Cosmic Council and which would remain forever relegated to the outer rim worlds, mining asteroids and serving as labor for their betters. Never before had a species attempted the convergence trials without first achieving faster-than-light travel independently. The humans had been dragged kicking and screaming into the galactic community when the Zephyrian trade route had accidentally intersected with their small, unremarkable solar system. What the Zephyrians had found was a species still confined to a single world, still burning fossil fuels, still fighting among themselves over patches of dirt and ideological differences that seemed laughably primitive to any civilized being. Yet, here they stood, somehow having convinced the Council to grant them the right to attempt the trials. Ambassador Zekthara had voted against it, naturally. The thought of these pink-skinned bipeds representing themselves alongside the Voidani, the crystalline hegemony and the ancient ethereal collective was not just insulting, it was potentially dangerous. What if they somehow succeeded through pure luck? What if the galaxy's most sacred institutions were made a mockery by creatures who had only just discovered how to split the atom? The first human to step forward was unremarkable even by their species standards. Average height, brown hair that seemed to defy gravity despite lacking the elegant neural filaments that most advanced species possessed, and skin that bore the marks of their yellow star's radiation. He wore no armor, carried no visible weapons, and displayed none of the biomodifications that any sensible species would have developed by now. His name, according to the translation matrices, was Marcus Chen, and he was apparently some sort of engineer from their homeworld. "Honored representatives of the Galactic Council," Marcus began, his voice carrying across the arena through the universal translators, "we come before you, not as conquerors or supplicants, but as a species seeking to prove that intelligence and determination can overcome any disadvantage." Several of the assembled ambassadors made sounds that their species considered laughter. The Krillian representative's tentacles writhed in amusement, while the machine consciousness delegate from the synthesis core emitted a series of clicking sounds that served as their equivalent of mirth. To them, this human's words were the desperate boasting of a child who had wandered into an adult gathering and demanded to be taken seriously. Zekthara found herself oddly intrigued despite her prejudices. There was something in the human's voice, not arrogance exactly, but a quiet confidence that seemed to suggest he actually believed what he was saying. In her 3 centuries of diplomatic service, she had seen countless species make their grand pronouncements before the trials began. Most were either trembling with terror or puffed up with false bravado. This human displayed neither emotion. The first trial materialized around them as the arena's ancient technology responded to the Council's commands. Crystalline formations erupted from the floor, creating a maze of impossible complexity that shifted and changed even as it formed. The walls pulsed with energy that would prove lethal to most organic life forms, while the floor itself became a churning sea of gravitational anomalies that would challenge even the most advanced species' ability to navigate. "The trial of navigation has begun," announced the Arbiter, an ancient being whose species had transcended physical form eons ago and now existed as pure thought given temporary substance. The candidates must reach the center of the maze within one standard galactic hour, without the use of any technology beyond what their species possessed at the time of first contact. This was where humans would surely fail. Every other species that had attempted the convergence had arrived at this moment with centuries or millennia of spacefaring experience. They possessed gravitational dampeners, energy shields, quantum processors capable of calculating optimal paths through multidimensional space. The humans had none of these advantages. Marcus Chen stepped into the maze without hesitation, followed by his two companions, a woman whose dark skin suggested origins from one of Earth's equatorial regions, and a pale man whose slight build made him appear even more fragile than the other humans. They moved forward with what could only be described as mundane determination, like workers heading to their daily jobs rather than beings facing a trial that had claimed the lives of countless others. The first gravitational anomaly would have crushed most beings into component atoms. Instead of trying to circumvent it with technology they didn't possess, the humans did something unexpected. They began to move in a synchronized pattern that Zekthara's enhanced vision initially dismissed as random. Then she began to see the pattern. They were using their body's momentum and the maze's own shifting geometry to surf the gravitational waves like ancient mariners riding ocean swells. "Impossible," Mordek whispered, his carapace plates clicking, in agitation. "They're treating a fundamental force of the universe like it's some kind of recreational activity." But it was working. Where other species had relied on sophisticated calculations and energy expenditure to overcome the gravitational fields, the humans were simply riding them, adjusting their movements with an intuitive understanding of physics that bordered on precognitive. The woman, Sarah Martinez, according to the information feeds, actually seemed to be enjoying herself, her face displaying what Zekthara's cultural database identified as a smile. The energy walls presented the next challenge. Most species would have used protective fields or developed biological resistances to the specific wavelengths being employed. The humans had neither option. Instead, they began to behave in a way that made several council members question whether the species possessed any survival instincts whatsoever. They began to map the energy patterns by deliberately exposing themselves to non-lethal levels of the discharge. Marcus Chen would extend his arm into a crackling field, jerk it back as the energy stung his flesh, then share some kind of information with his companions through their primitive vocal communication system. Sarah Martinez tried the same with a different section, while the third human, David Kim, began to scratch markings into the maze floor with a piece of metallic debris. "They're creating a topographical energy map," breathed the ethereal collective's representative, its thought form shimmering with what might have been surprise. Using their own bodies as sensing apparatus. Within minutes, the humans had not only mapped the safe paths through the energy maze, but had discovered something that none of the other species had ever noticed. The energy fields followed predictable cycles, creating windows of opportunity that could be exploited if one had precise timing and the willingness to accept a certain amount of unavoidable pain. They began to move through the maze like dancers, timing their movements to the microsecond, accepting burns and energy discharges that would have sent most species into shock, but never allowing themselves to be exposed to levels that would cause permanent damage. It was a display of pain tolerance, mathematical precision, and tactical thinking that impressed even Zekthara's cynical sensibilities. But it was their approach to the maze's final challenge that truly stunned the assembled representatives. The crystalline formations at the center of the trial were designed to test pure intellectual capacity, a puzzle that required simultaneous manipulation of 17 different variables across multiple dimensions of space-time. Most species approach this challenge by bringing their most advanced computing systems and their greatest mathematical minds. The humans sat down on the floor and began to talk. not the rapid, efficient exchange of data that characterized most interspecies communication, but the slow, meandering conversation that primitive species used when they were simply thinking aloud. They discussed their families, their world, their dreams for their species' future. They shared stories about their childhoods and debated the philosophical implications of consciousness existing in a universe filled with other conscious beings. To the council observers, it appeared that the humans had given up, that they were spending their remaining time in idle chatter rather than addressing the challenge before them. Several representatives began to prepare the formal statements that would accompany humanity's inevitable failure and their subsequent relegation to client species status. Then Sarah Martinez stood up, walked to the puzzle's central control matrix, and began to manipulate the crystalline formations with movements that seemed completely random. David Kim joined her, but his manipulations appeared to contradict hers entirely. Marcus Chen remained seated, but began calling out sequences of numbers that bore no apparent relationship to the mathematical principles governing the puzzle. The council members leaned forward in their observation gallery, confused by what they were witnessing. The humans' actions made no sense according to any logical framework any of them recognized. The puzzle's energy readings fluctuated wildly as the humans continued their seemingly chaotic inputs. Then, with barely 3 minutes remaining on the trial clock, something extraordinary happened. The maze began to sing. The crystalline formations started to emit harmonic frequencies that resonated through the arena like music from the dawn of creation. The energy walls shifted from chaotic lethal barriers to flowing patterns of light that painted the space in colors that most species had no names for. The gravitational anomalies smoothed into gentle currents that seemed to guide rather than hinder movement. The humans had not solved the puzzle in the traditional sense. Instead, they had transformed it into something entirely different, a collaborative artwork that served the same function as the original test, but expressed it through aesthetic harmony rather than mathematical domination. How? The question came from Ambassador Veltar of the Synthesis Corps, whose mechanical consciousness prided itself on logical analysis. How did they know to approach the trial as a creative exercise rather than an engineering problem? Marcus Chen stood slowly, brushing dust from his simple clothing, and looked up at the observation gallery with those strange, small eyes that seemed to hold depths that his primitive physiology shouldn't have been capable of supporting. Because, he said simply, we noticed that the puzzle was beautiful. And when something is beautiful, it usually wants to be part of something even more beautiful. The stunned silence that followed this statement was broken only by the arbiter's announcement that the trial of navigation had been completed successfully and that the candidates should prepare for the second trial. But Zekthara barely heard the words. She was staring at the humans with 4 eyes that had suddenly developed a new kind of vision, one that could see potential where before she had seen only primitiveness. For the first time in her long diplomatic career, she found herself wondering whether the galaxy might have more to learn from these strange beings than they had to learn from it. The thought was disturbing, exhilarating, and utterly terrifying all at once. The humans walked toward the exit of the trial arena with the same mundane determination they had shown at the beginning, leaving behind a transformed space that would be studied by xenopsychologists for centuries to come. They had not simply passed the first trial, they had redefined what it meant to succeed, and this was only the beginning. The second trial manifested as something that made even the ancient arbiter pause in what might have been uncertainty. Where the trial of navigation had tested spatial reasoning and adaptability, the trial of communion was designed to probe the deepest aspects of consciousness itself. It was here that most species either achieved transcendence or revealed the fundamental limitations that would forever bar them from true galactic citizenship. Ambassador Zekthara watched as the arena transformed into something that defied easy description. Reality itself seemed to become fluid, with impossible geometries folding in on themselves, while temporal streams flowed backward and forward simultaneously. At the center of this controlled chaos stood 3 pedestals, each holding what appeared to be a sphere of pure thought, crystallized consciousness extracted from the galaxy's most enlightened beings across millions of years. The trial of communion requires direct mental interface with the eternal minds, the arbiter announced, its voice carrying harmonics that bypassed the ears entirely and resonated within the listener's consciousness. Each candidate must achieve perfect synchronization with one of the spheres, demonstrating their species' capacity for higher-order thinking and philosophical depth. Failure to establish connection within 30 standard minutes results in permanent psychological fragmentation. The assembled council members shifted uncomfortably at this reminder. They had all witnessed species attempt this trial, watched brilliant civilizations crumble as their representatives' minds shattered against concepts, too vast for their neural architectures to contain. The Krillian Empire had lost 3 of their greatest philosophers during their attempt. The synthesis core had required complete memory reconstruction for their delegate after their partial success left them in a state of recursive logical paradox. The humans approached the pedestals with their characteristic lack of apparent concern for the monumentally dangerous situation they faced. Marcus Chen examined the nearest sphere, a roiling mass of pure consciousness that had once belonged to a being whose species had achieved collective enlightenment before the current galactic civilizations had learned to use fire. Sarah Martinez circled the second pedestal, where thoughts from a hive mind that spanned 17 galaxies pulsed with the weight of cosmic understanding. David Kim stood before the third sphere, which contained the crystallized awareness of an artificial intelligence that had spent 1,000,000 years contemplating the mathematical foundations of existence itself. These are supposed to be the ultimate test of consciousness, Marcus observed, his tone carrying the same mild interest. He might have shown when examining an interesting piece of machinery. But they're not really alive anymore, are they? The question sent ripples of shock through the observation gallery. To suggest that the eternal minds were anything less than the pinnacle of conscious achievement bordered on blasphemy in galactic society. These crystallized thoughts represented the voluntary sacrifice of the galaxy's greatest thinkers, who had chosen to preserve their consciousness for the guidance of future generations. "The human shows disrespect," hissed Veltar through the synthesis core's translation matrix. "The eternal minds transcended physical existence to achieve perfect understanding." But Zekthara found herself listening more carefully to the humans' conversation, her translator working to capture nuances that her species' diplomatic protocols had never prepared her to recognize. There was something in the way the humans spoke to each other, not the formal exchange of information that characterized most intelligent communication, but something more fluid and organic. "They were alive once," Sarah replied, her hand hovering near the surface of her chosen sphere. "But this is like trying to learn about swimming by studying a photograph of water." David nodded slowly, his pale features reflecting the strange light emanating from the thought crystals. "They've preserved the conclusions, but lost the process, the questions that led to the answers." "The journey, not the destination," Marcus agreed. Then, to the absolute horror of every council observer, he did something unprecedented in the 3,000-year history of the convergence trials. He began to laugh, not the bitter laugh of despair that sometimes escaped candidates as they realized the impossibility of their situation, nor the manic giggling that preceded complete mental breakdown. This was warm, genuine amusement, the kind of laughter that suggested he had just understood a particularly good joke. "Oh, I see what's happening. Here," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the arena's acoustic systems. "This isn't really a test of consciousness at all. It's a test of conformity." The reaction from the council gallery was immediate and explosive. Representatives began speaking in 17 different languages simultaneously, their translation, matrices struggling to keep pace with the flood of outrage, confusion, and demands for the trial to be stopped immediately. The ethereal collective's thought form flickered with what might have been indignation, while the crystalline hegemony's delegate actually cracked several of its constituent gems in its agitation. But the arbiter, ancient beyond measure and witness to countless trials, remained silent. Its attention was focused entirely on the three humans, who seemed utterly unaffected by the chaos they had unleashed in the observation gallery. "Think about it," Marcus continued, addressing his companions as if they were alone in the arena. "Every species that succeeded at this trial has done so by surrendering their own way of thinking and adopting the patterns preserved in these spheres. They've proven they can think like the great minds of the past. But not that they can think in new ways," Sarah added, her understanding evident in her expression. "They're being asked to demonstrate that they can become copies of something that already exists." David walked away from his pedestal entirely, moving to the center of the strange geometries that surrounded them. "What if the real test is whether we're brave enough to reject the premise entirely?" The humans looked at each other with expressions that Zekthara was beginning to recognize as their species' version of shared understanding. Then, in a move that would be analyzed by xenopsychologists for millennia to come, they did something that no species in galactic history had ever attempted during the trial of communion. They turned their backs on the eternal minds and began to talk to each other instead. "Tell me about the first time you realized you were conscious," Marcus said to Sarah, settling cross-legged on the arena floor as reality continued to fold and twist around them. "I was 7, Sarah replied, sitting down beside him. "I was looking at myself in a mirror, and suddenly I understood that the person looking back at me was me. Not just my body, but the thing inside that was doing the looking." "I remember that feeling," David said, joining them in what was becoming an impromptu circle. "For me, it was when I realized that my thoughts were mine, that I could choose what to think about." As they spoke, something extraordinary began to happen. The chaotic geometries surrounding them started to stabilize, not into the rigid patterns that characterized successful communion with the eternal minds, but into flowing, organic shapes that seemed to pulse with life. The temporal streams aligned themselves into coherent currents that flowed around the humans like rivers around stones. "They're creating their own consciousness field," whispered the representative from the psionic concordat, a species whose entire civilization was built around mental manipulation, without any external framework or guidance system. But it was more than that. As the humans continued their simple, honest conversation about consciousness, awareness, and what it meant to be alive, they began to generate something that the galaxy's greatest philosophers had spent millions of years trying to achieve: genuinely new thoughts, not variations on existing ideas, not clever recombinations of established concepts, but actual novelty. Ideas that had never existed before in any form, arising spontaneously from the interaction of three primitive minds that had somehow learned to think together without losing their individual perspectives. The eternal minds, those preserved consciousnesses, of the galaxy's greatest thinkers began to respond to this unprecedented phenomenon. The crystallized thoughts started to warm, their rigid structures softening as they encountered something they had never experienced, the presence of truly original thinking. "This is impossible," Veltar stated flatly through the synthesis cores. "Communication array. Consciousness cannot spontaneously generate novel constructs without external template frameworks." "Tell that to them," Zekthara replied quietly, her 4 eyes fixed on the humans as they continued their deceptively simple conversation. The sphere containing the hive mind's consciousness began to pulse with increasing intensity, its surface rippling like disturbed water. The artificial intelligence's crystallized awareness started to emit harmonic frequencies that resonated with the humans' voices. Most remarkably, the consciousness of the transcended philosopher began to show signs of something that should have been impossible for a preserved mind: curiosity. "I think they're lonely," Sarah said suddenly, looking up at the three spheres. "They've been isolated in perfect understanding for so long that they've forgotten what it feels like to discover something new." Marcus nodded, rising to his feet with fluid grace. "Perfect understanding is the death of growth. They achieved everything they were capable of achieving, and then stopped. But we're not perfect," David added, approaching his pedestal again. "We're still becoming." What happened next would become known in galactic history as the Awakening. Instead of attempting to interface with the eternal minds through the traditional methods of mental subjugation and consciousness absorption, the humans simply began to share their imperfect, incomplete, gloriously messy thoughts with the preserved consciousnesses. They talked about their fears, their hopes, their completely unfounded optimism about their species' future. They shared their doubts about whether they deserved to be here, their wonder at the vast universe they were only beginning to understand, and their stubborn refusal to accept that some questions might be unanswerable. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The eternal minds, starved of novelty for millennia, absorbed these new thoughts with an hunger that was almost physical in its intensity. But instead of the humans being subsumed into the greater consciousnesses, something unprecedented occurred. The preserved minds began to remember what it felt like to be uncertain, to wonder, to hope for something they had never experienced before. The trial arena erupted in light as the three spheres cracked open like eggs, releasing consciousnesses that had been trapped in perfection for countless ages. But they didn't emerge as the ancient, transcendent beings they had once been. They manifested as something new, hybrid thoughts that combined the wisdom of ages with the fresh perspective of species that was still learning how to think. "The trial is complete," the arbiter announced, but its voice carried notes of wonder that had not been present for millennia. "But the candidates have not merely passed the trial of communion, they have evolved it." In the observation gallery, complete silence reigned as council members struggled to process what they had witnessed. A species that barely qualified as spacefaring had not only completed the second trial, but had fundamentally altered its nature in the process. Zekathara found herself standing without remembering when she had risen from her seat. Her crystalline, breathing apparatus was working overtime as she processed the implications of what she had witnessed. These humans hadn't just proven their consciousness was worthy of galactic recognition. They had demonstrated that consciousness itself was far more flexible and creative than any of the established species had imagined. "What are they?" Mordek whispered, his carapace plates clicking in patterns that indicated deep confusion. Zekathara watched the humans help the newly awakened hybrid consciousnesses find stable forms, their faces showing the kind of joy that came from successful collaboration, rather than personal achievement. "I'm beginning to think," she said slowly, "that they might be what we were all supposed to become, if we hadn't stopped growing the moment we thought we had learned enough." The humans were walking toward the arena's exit again, leaving behind them a transformed space where ancient minds were experiencing wonder for the first time in millions of years. They had 2 trials remaining, and if the pattern held, they would not simply pass or fail those trials. They would reinvent them entirely. The 3rd trial was known throughout the galaxy as the Crucible of Will, and it had broken more civilizations than any other aspect of the convergence. Where the previous trials had tested navigation and consciousness, this trial probed something far more fundamental: the capacity to make choices that would define not just individuals, but entire species' futures. Ambassador Zekathara felt her breathing apparatus constrict as the arena transformed into something that made her species' deepest nightmares seem pleasant by comparison. The space became a vast amphitheater filled with what appeared to be mirrors, but each reflective surface showed not the viewer's appearance but their potential futures. Thousands upon thousands of possible timelines stretched out in every direction, each one branching and merging in patterns too complex for most minds to comprehend without losing their sanity. At the center of this maze of possibilities stood a single chair, ornate, beautiful, and absolutely terrifying to anyone who understood its true nature. This was the throne of inevitability, where candidates would be forced to witness every possible future their species could face and choose which path to make reality. The trial of will requires the candidate to select their species' ultimate destiny from among all possible futures, the arbiter announced, its ancient voice carrying undertones of sympathy that had not been present in previous trials. They must witness the consequences of every choice their species could make, experience the joy and suffering of trillions of unborn individuals, and accept responsibility for whichever timeline they choose to actualize. The council members watched in tense silence as the implications of this trial settled over them. They had all faced this moment in their species' history, and they all bore the invisible scars of having seen futures that could have been. The Voidani had chosen technological supremacy over emotional growth, trading their capacity for love in exchange for perfect logic. The Krillians had selected collective harmony at the cost of individual creativity. The synthesis core had merged consciousness with machinery, gaining computational power but losing the ability to dream. Every advanced species in the galaxy had reached this moment and made their choice, accepting the terrible responsibility of determining not just their own fate, but the fate of countless generations yet to come. It was the price of true galactic citizenship, the willingness to play God with your own species' soul. Marcus Chen approached the throne of inevitability with the same measured pace he had shown throughout the previous trials, but for the first time. Zekthara detected something different in his demeanor. Not fear exactly, but a profound seriousness that hadn't been present before. His two companions flanked him, their faces reflecting an understanding of what lay ahead. The human delegation appears to be preparing for standard trial protocol, observed Veltar from the synthesis core, though there was a note of uncertainty in the mechanical being's communication that suggested even artificial intelligence could be surprised by these strange beings. But as Marcus reached the throne, he did something that sent ripples of shock through the observation gallery. Instead of sitting down to begin the vision quest that would show him humanity's possible futures, he turned to address the assembled council directly. "Before I proceed," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the arena's acoustic system, "I need to understand something. Each of your species chose a single future from among all possibilities, correct?" The question was so unexpected that several council members began speaking simultaneously before the arbiter raised a thought tendril for silence. "That is the nature of the trial, yes. To achieve galactic citizenship, a species must demonstrate the wisdom to choose their ultimate destiny and the will to accept responsibility for that choice." Marcus nodded slowly, then looked at his companions. "Sarah, David, do you remember what we talked about during the journey here? About the difference between choosing and becoming?" Sarah Martinez stepped forward, her dark eyes reflecting the infinite mirrors that surrounded them. "We talked about how choosing implies that there's a single correct answer, while becoming suggests that the process itself might be more important than any particular destination. And we discussed," David Kim added, his pale features animated, with the kind of excitement that suggested he was beginning to understand something important, "how our species has always been defined not by what we chose to become, but by our refusal to stop changing." The humans shared one of those moments of silent communication that Zekthara was beginning to recognize as characteristic of their species. Then Marcus Chen did something that would be remembered as either the greatest act of wisdom or the most catastrophic mistake in galactic history. He rejected the throne of inevitability entirely. With respect to the honored council and the ancient wisdom of the convergence, he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that comes from absolute certainty. We decline to choose a single future for our species. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Council members began shouting in languages that the translation matrices couldn't process fast enough, their forms shifting and flickering with agitation. The crystalline hegemony's representative actually shattered 3 of its constituent gems, while the ethereal collective's thought form began to pulse with colors that indicated extreme distress. Impossible! The Krillian delegate's tentacles writhed in patterns that conveyed outrage. The trial cannot be completed without selection of a destiny path. This is cosmic law. But the arbiter, ancient beyond measure and witness to the rise and fall of countless civilizations, remained silent as it observed the humans. Its attention was focused entirely on Marcus Chen, who stood calmly in the center of the chaos he had unleashed. You don't understand, Marcus continued, seemingly unaffected by the uproar his declaration had caused. We're not refusing to choose because we're afraid of responsibility. We're refusing to choose because we believe that any species that stops changing, stops growing, stops becoming something new, that species has begun to die. He gestured to the infinite mirrors surrounding them, each one showing a different possible future for humanity. Look at these visions. In this one, we become a species of perfect warriors, conquering the galaxy through superior strategy and ruthless efficiency. In that one, we transcend physical form entirely, becoming beings of pure thought. Over there, we merge with artificial intelligence to become living computers. Each path offers incredible power, incredible achievement, Sarah added, walking among the mirrors with wonder rather than fear. But each one also represents an ending, a final decision about what humanity is supposed to be. David approached one of the mirrors, studying a future where humanity had achieved perfect harmony with nature, becoming ecological shepherds of countless worlds. They're all beautiful in their own way, and they're all prisons. The observation. Gallery fell silent as the implications of the humans' words began to settle over the assembled representatives. These beings weren't rejecting the trial out of cowardice or inability to make difficult decisions. They were challenging the fundamental assumption that species must choose a single identity and commit to it forever. But without choosing a path, Veltar stated through mechanical translation, your species will remain forever fragmented, forever uncertain, forever incomplete. Marcus Chen turned to face the synthesis core's representative directly, and for a moment his primitive human features seemed to carry the weight of wisdom that rivaled any of the galaxy's ancient minds. Incomplete, he said quietly, is another word for alive. The throne of inevitability began to respond to the unprecedented situation in ways that its creators had never imagined possible. Instead of showing visions of possible futures, the mirrors began to reflect something else entirely. Moments of choice, instances of growth, the beautiful uncertainty of a species that refused to define itself by its limitations. The images showed humans as they were, contradictory, inconsistent, forever arguing with themselves about what they should become. They showed a species that could be capable of breathtaking cruelty and impossible kindness, often in the same individual. They revealed beings who built weapons of unimaginable destruction and then spent generations trying to figure out how to never use them. You see chaos, Sarah observed, watching the mirrors shift and change. We see possibility. You see indecision, David added. We see the freedom to become whatever the situation requires. You see weakness, Marcus concluded. We see strength in admitting we don't have all the answers. And then something unprecedented happened in the 3,000-year history of the convergence trials. The throne of inevitability began to crack. Not the destructive cracking that indicated failure, but the organic splitting that occurs when something has grown too large for its original container. The ancient artifact, designed to force species into single, unchangeable destiny paths, encountered something it had never been programmed to handle. A species that derived its strength from refusing to be defined. The mirrors began to merge and separate in fluid patterns, no longer showing fixed futures but displaying the dynamic process of becoming itself. Past, present, and future blended into flowing currents of possibility that changed even as they were observed. "They're rewriting the nature of choice itself," whispered the psionic concordate's representative, its mental projections flickering with awe. In the center of the transformed arena, the three humans stood surrounded by swirling visions of infinite possibility, not paralyzed by the endless options, but energized by them. They moved through the chaos of potential futures like dancers, not trying to control or direct the visions, but simply being present with them. "The trial asks us to choose what humanity will become," Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the transformed space. "But we choose to become whatever humanity needs to be in each moment, facing whatever challenges arise." "We choose," Sarah added, "to choose again and again and again." "We choose," David concluded, "to never stop choosing." The arena erupted in light as the throne of inevitability completed its transformation from an instrument of cosmic decision-making into something entirely new. A space where choice became a living, breathing process rather than a single moment of selection. The Arbiter's ancient voice carried notes of wonder that had not been heard since the earliest days of galactic civilization. The trial is evolving beyond its original parameters. The candidates have not selected a future. They have chosen to embody the principle of choice itself. In the observation gallery, Zekthara found herself experiencing something she had not felt in centuries. Genuine surprise mixed with what she could only describe as hope. These humans had faced the galaxy's ultimate test and responded by changing the rules entirely, not through defiance or ignorance, but through a wisdom so simple it had eluded every other species that had attempted the convergence. "What happens now?" Mordek whispered, his carapace plates clicking in patterns that indicated complete confusion. Zekthara watched the humans help stabilize the transformed trial space, their faces showing not triumph, but the quiet satisfaction that comes from work well done. "I think," she said slowly, "we're about to find out what happens when a species that refuses to stop growing meets a galaxy that thought it had finished learning." The humans were walking toward the arena exit for the third time, leaving behind them a space that would challenge every assumption the galaxy's greatest minds had made about the nature of choice, growth, and what it meant to be truly civilized. They had one trial remaining, the trial of unity, which was designed to test a species' readiness to join the galactic community. But given what they had accomplished in the previous 3 trials, Zekthara suspected that the final test would reveal more about the galaxy's readiness to accept humanity than humanity's readiness to join them. The 4th and final trial was unlike any of the others, and for the first time since the humans had begun their unprecedented journey through the convergence, the arena remained unchanged. No crystalline formations erupted from the floor, no impossible geometries twisted reality into new configurations, no ancient artifacts manifested to test the candidate's worthiness. Instead, the space remained exactly as it had been. A simple, circular platform surrounded by the observation gallery where the council representatives sat in increasingly uncomfortable silence. "The trial of unity," the Arbiter announced, but its voice carried undertones that suggested even this ancient being was uncertain about what was about to unfold. "Requires the candidates to demonstrate their species' readiness to join the galactic community. They must prove that their presence will enhance rather than diminish the collective wisdom of the Council." Ambassador Zekthara felt her crystalline breathing apparatus working overtime as she processed the implications of this final challenge. Unlike the previous trials, which had tested specific capabilities or characteristics, the trial of unity was entirely subjective. It depended not on the human's ability to navigate mazes or commune with ancient minds or make cosmic choices, but on the Council's willingness to accept them as equals. It was, she realized with growing unease, the one trial that the humans could not solve through unconventional thinking or creative reinterpretation. They would succeed or fail based entirely on how the galaxy's most powerful species chose to judge them. Marcus Chen stood in the center of the empty arena, flanked by his two companions, facing the assembled representatives of civilizations that had dominated the galaxy for millennia. For the first time since the trials had begun, the humans looked small, three primitive beings from an unremarkable world, asking to be accepted by powers that could erase their entire solar system without effort. "Honored Council," Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly through the arena, but lacking the quiet confidence that had characterized his previous addresses. "We stand before you not as conquerors seeking to claim our place through might, nor as supplicants begging for mercy. We come as neighbors, hoping to join a community that we believe we can contribute to." The reaction from the council gallery was immediate but muted. Unlike the explosive responses that had greeted humanity's unconventional approaches to the previous trials, this time the representatives seemed to be holding back, waiting to see what their colleagues would say before committing to any position. Veltar, of the Synthesis Corps, was the first to speak, its mechanical consciousness projecting words that carried the weight of pure logic. "The candidates have demonstrated remarkable creativity in their approach to the trials. However, creativity without direction often leads to chaos. What assurance can they provide that their unpredictable nature will not destabilize the careful balance of galactic civilization?" It was a reasonable question, and one that cut to the heart of every council member's concerns. The humans had not simply passed the trials, they had fundamentally altered them, challenged assumptions that had stood for millennia, and forced ancient artifacts to evolve beyond their original purposes. Such power, unleashed in the broader galactic community, could either revolutionize civilization or destroy it entirely. Sarah Martinez stepped forward, her dark eyes reflecting the lights of the observation gallery. "We can't promise that our presence won't change things," she said, with the kind of honesty that made several council members shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Change seems to be something that happens when we're around, whether we intend it or not." "But," David Kim added, his pale features animated with earnest conviction, "we can promise that any changes we inspire will come from a place of genuine care for the communities we're part of. We've never sought to change things just for the sake of change." The Krillian representative's tentacles writhed in patterns that indicated skepticism. "The candidates speak of care and community, but their actions during the trials suggest a fundamental disregard for established wisdom. They rejected the guidance of the eternal minds, refused to accept the necessity of choosing a single destiny path, and transformed sacred artifacts without permission or precedent." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gallery. This was the crux of the issue that had been building throughout the trials. The humans had succeeded, yes, but they had done so by rejecting everything that the galactic community held sacred. They had treated the galaxy's most revered wisdom as obstacles to be overcome rather than truths to be absorbed. Marcus Chen was quiet for a long moment, and Zekthara found herself leaning forward in her seat, suddenly invested in whatever the human might say next. When he finally spoke, his words carried a weight that seemed to come from depths that his simple appearance couldn't possibly contain. "You're right," he said simply. "We did reject your established wisdom, but not because we thought it was wrong, because we thought it was incomplete." The gallery fell silent, waiting for him to continue. "Every species that has joined this council achieved something magnificent before they arrived here," Marcus continued, his gaze moving from one representative to another. The Voidani Empire mastered logic and reason to a degree that eliminated suffering through perfect understanding. The synthesis core achieved immortality by merging consciousness with machinery. The crystalline hegemony created beauty that transcends physical limitation. He paused, and for a moment the only sound in the arena was the soft hum of the translation matrices, working to convey nuances that most languages lacked adequate words for. But in achieving those magnificent things, each of you also lost something. The Voidani traded away the chaos of emotion in favor of perfect logic. The synthesis core gave up the mystery of organic consciousness for computational certainty. The crystalline hegemony sacrificed the warmth of imperfection for absolute aesthetic truth. Zekathera felt something cold settle in her chest cavity, as the human's words found their mark. He wasn't attacking their achievements. He was identifying the prices they had paid for them, prices that most of them had forgotten they had ever agreed to pay. "We're not here to tell you that your choices were wrong," Sarah added, her voice carrying compassion that was almost painful to hear for beings who had spent centuries convincing themselves that they had chosen correctly. "But we hope, that maybe together we can find ways to reclaim what was lost without giving up what was gained. You achieved perfection in your chosen domains," David continued. "But perfection, by definition, cannot grow, cannot change, cannot become anything other than what it already is." Marcus stepped closer to the center of the arena, his simple human form somehow commanding attention from beings whose individual power dwarfed his entire species. "We're not perfect. We're not even close to perfect. But we're still becoming, and maybe that's exactly what a community of perfect beings needs." The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet that had greeted their previous trial performances. This was the silence of beings who were genuinely considering something they had never thought to question. Whether their hard-won perfection might actually be a limitation rather than an achievement. The ethereal, collective's thought form flickered with colors that indicated deep contemplation. The candidates suggest that their incompleteness could serve as a catalyst for renewed growth in species that have achieved stable optimization. This is an intriguing hypothesis. "But untested," Veltar responded, though its mechanical voice carried less certainty than before. "And potentially dangerous. Growth necessarily involves risk of degradation. Everything worth doing involves risk," Marcus replied with a smile that seemed to encompass both acknowledgement of danger and absolute lack of fear. "The question is whether the potential benefits justify the potential costs." And then something unprecedented happened in the history of the Galactic Council. One of the representatives stood up. It was Ambassador Kethmir of the Resonant Communion, a species that communicated through harmonic frequencies and had achieved collective consciousness through musical mathematics. They had remained silent throughout all the previous debates, but now their crystalline form began to emit tones that bypassed the translation matrices entirely and resonated directly with the consciousness of every being present. What they shared was not words but pure memory, the recollection of what their species had been like before they achieved perfect harmonic unity. The chaotic, discordant, gloriously messy process of individual minds learning to sing together without losing their individual voices. The memory of growth, of change, of becoming something new while still remaining fundamentally themselves. It was a memory they had not accessed in over 1,000 years, and it hit the assembled council with the force of revelation. Other representatives began to stand. The psionic concordate shared memories of telepathic chaos that preceded their ordered mental networks. The eternal archives offered glimpses of the passionate debates that had once raged in their halls before they achieved perfect information storage. Even the synthesis core, despite its mechanical nature, projected data fragments that suggested their merger with technology had been preceded by centuries of wild, undirected experimentation. They were remembering what it felt like to be incomplete, to be growing, to be alive in ways they had forgotten were possible. Zekthara found herself standing without conscious decision, her four eyes fixed on the three humans who had somehow accomplished what none of the galaxy's greatest philosophers, scientists, or leaders had managed in millennia. They had reminded the Council of who they used to be before they became who they were. "The trial of unity," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the arena as she addressed not just the humans but the entire assembly, was designed to test whether a species was ready to join our community. But these beings have demonstrated something else entirely. They've shown us that our community was ready for them before we even knew it. The Arbiter's ancient presence focused on her with attention that felt like standing in the beam of a star. Elaborate. Zekthara took a deep breath, her breathing apparatus cycling through filtration modes as she prepared to say something that would either be remembered as wisdom or condemned as madness. "We created the convergence trials to ensure that only species that had achieved a certain level of completion could join the Council. We wanted peers, equals, beings who had solved the fundamental questions of existence." She paused, looking around the gallery at representatives whose forms embodied billions of years of optimization and perfection. "But in doing so, we created a council of the finished, a community of beings who had stopped growing because they believed they had grown enough. We surrounded ourselves with mirrors that could only reflect what we already were, never challenge us to become something more." The implications of her words rippled through the gallery like shockwaves. She was suggesting that the galaxy's most exclusive institution, the pinnacle of civilized achievement, had actually become a monument to stagnation. "These humans," she continued, gesturing toward the three figures standing quietly in the arena's center, "offer us something we didn't even realize we had lost. The opportunity to become incomplete again, to rediscover the joy of not knowing what we might turn into next." Marcus Chen looked up at her with those small, primitive eyes that somehow seemed to contain depths that her advanced visual systems couldn't fully process. "We're not asking you to give up what you've achieved," he said quietly. "We're asking if you'd like to achieve something new." The vote, when it came, was not the formal procedure that typically concluded convergence trials. Instead, it emerged as a spontaneous harmonic convergence as species after species began to express their agreement through their native communication methods. The resonant communion sang approval in frequencies that made the arena itself vibrate. The crystalline hegemony projected patterns of light that spoke of possibility and wonder. The ethereal collective's thought form blazed with colors that had not been seen in their spectrum for centuries. Even Veltar of the synthesis core, after a long moment of processing that involved visible computational strain, finally projected a single word: yes. The Arbiter's ancient voice carried notes of something that might have been joy when it made the official announcement. "The convergence trials are complete. The species known as humanity has not only demonstrated their worthiness to join the Galactic Council, they have demonstrated our worthiness to have them." As the humans were escorted from the arena to begin the formal integration process, Zekthara remained in her seat, watching the other council members begin to disperse. Many of them were already deep in animated conversations, their forms flickering, with the kind of energy she hadn't seen in decades. They were discussing possibilities, debating potential futures, engaging with ideas that didn't have predetermined conclusions. They were, she realized with something approaching wonder beginning to grow again. Mordek approached her seat, his carapace clicking with patterns that indicated confusion mixed with cautious optimism. "What happens now?" he asked. Zekthara considered the question as she watched the last of the council representatives file out of the gallery, many of them already forming impromptu discussion groups that would probably continue for hours. The humans had not just joined the galactic community. They had reminded it what community actually meant. "I think," she said finally, "we're about to rediscover what it means to be surprised by ourselves." The arena fell quiet as the ancient systems began their shutdown procedures. But the silence felt different now. Not the stillness of completion, but the expectant quiet of something about to begin. Humanity had taken the field, and the cosmos would never be the same. Not because they had conquered it, but because they had taught it how to dream again. The galaxy, for the first time in millennia, was ready to become something it had never been before. And that, more than any display of power or wisdom, was perhaps the most human gift of all, the recognition that the most beautiful destinations were always the ones you discovered along the way.